נגיד גודלך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש לדור ודור.
Shalom. Before I begin my Torah drosh today, I'd like to speak to you about two events that are occurring in the Middle East as we speak. Both of them are great protests, one in Syria and one in Israel. Both of these protest movements are peaceful. In Syria, the people have risen against their government in a peaceful fashion, and they are now demanding freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of political association, freedom to have some influence over the way they are governed. And how has that government reacted? Well, about 2,000 Syrians to date have died as a result of a brutal crackdown on the part of the Syrian government. Thousands more have been injured or displaced from their homes. We know of about 15,000 Syrians who've crossed the border into Turkey, fleeing from the brutality of their own government. In Israel, now let's take a look at what's happening in Israel, right, which is a neighboring country. In Israel, people, a lot of people, are not happy with the housing policies of their government. And young people have taken to the streets in a peaceful fashion. Many have set up pup tents along the streets in Tel Aviv as well as other cities. And they are making clear their disagreement with their government. And what's been the reaction of the Israeli government? Well, the Prime Minister has called for dialogue with the protesters, recognizing that they have some legitimate concerns. We see members of the Israeli cabinet and the Knesset going to where the protesters are, sitting with them, talking with them, engaging in dialogue. We see that there is a debate in the papers as to how to address the housing crisis in Israel. What a contrast! What a contrast between the Syrian government, which is a fascist, violent, brutal regime, and the Israeli government, and what's happening on the streets of Israel. Israel still being the only functioning democracy in that area of the world. Well, I'd like to go on now with my drash on this week's Torah portion. Our Torah portion for this week is Ekev. It's the third portion of the book of Deuteronomy. It begins with chapter 7, verse 12 of the book of Deuteronomy. At the beginning of this Torah portion, Moses continues his discourse about what has transpired to the Jewish people during those 40 years that have elapsed between the time they left Egypt to this point in their history, this time in which they are standing on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, preparing to cross the river and to be led by Joshua in the conquest of the land of Canaan. Now, Moses' retrospective, so to speak, takes on a more theological tone here. It's not just a look at the past, it's also a prophecy in certain ways. He understands that the generation that he's speaking to is quite different from the generation that he led out of Egypt. This generation, by and large, had been born in the desert. They were toughened. They were strong, confident people, unlike their parents' generation, who had experienced slavery in Egypt, who had lost faith in themselves and refused to go out and conquer the land. And so Moses understands that he has to temper his message in this Torah portion. He knows that this generation, under the leadership of Joshua, will have its victories. It will simply go into the land and conquer the existing peoples there. And that the people's material success, their level of prosperity, will undoubtedly rise, because the land of Israel is a productive, fruitful land, as opposed to the Sinai wilderness. And he warns them not to engage in idolatry. Was he worrying that they would go and worship other gods, perhaps Balak or Malach or Baal or Astarte? I'm sure he was worried about that. But I think he had in mind a certain kind of idolatry that plagued our people in ancient times, and also has come to be a feature of our contemporary times, of this generation, our generation in 2011. And that's the idolatry of arrogance, the idolatry of gross materialism, the idolatry of egotism. Moses tells us that we should not think that our victories in life are all due to our own virtue, that we must cultivate within our hearts a sense of gratitude and humility. Humility, anava, as we call it in Hebrew. Now, humility, in the Jewish sense of the word, is different from the way that people in Eastern cultures understand humility. If you speak to a Buddhist about the concept of humility, they will speak of the endeavor to rid oneself of the ego. Not so in Judaism. We understand that we human beings are partners with God, and that there are certain things that for which we have to take the initiative, and we should expand our sense of what we are able to do and our sense of self. But there are times in which we run up against the limitations of our human condition, and we must sort of contract our egos and come to realize that to a great extent we are dependent on forces that are transcendent, that are above us, that we from time to time must come to rely on God. And the wisdom is to know when to do which. And that is probably the biggest challenge in the life of the Spirit. If there is one line, if there's one pasuk, one verse worth learning in Hebrew and in English from this week's Torah portion, it's from chapter 8, verse 3. Let me share it with you now. Lo al lechem levado yichye ha'adam ki al kol motza fi Adonai yichye ha'adam. A human being does not live on bread alone, but that one may live on anything that the Eternal decrees. I love this verse. It's full of practical wisdom, wisdom for life. We know we need material sustenance. We have to have bread. You can understand that word in its contemporary sense. Money. We need food. We need shelter over our heads. But there's something else that we need. We need that sense of spirituality in our lives. We need a sense of that we can accomplish much in our lives, and that much is in our hands. And we also understand that if we make life meaningful, to have a complete life, we have to understand that to a large extent we are dependent on God for our sustenance. for our very existences. So I hope that you will read this week's Torah portion and come to your own conclusions. And if you like, you can come and study with us here at Temple Bethel on Shabbat morning at 9:30 a.m. So Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next week.
Sing out to God, the maker of all, sure and strong. Let all of creation from mountain to sea